You can draw this in Procreate. You can draw this desert night scene in Procreate by using just the brushes that are already in the app. In this video, I will guide you through every step, showing you the different features in Procreate. I have already seen so many great results on Instagram. So be sure to follow this video tutorial all the way to the end and share your work on Instagram and tag me in the image. That way I will be able to find your work and perhaps you will see your artwork in the next You Can Draw This video. So, are you ready? Let's get started. First of all, our canvas is 2500 by 2500 pixels. And I have made a color palette. You can download it through a link in the description for free, of course. First thing we'll do is fill our background. We'll go to the layer palette right here, click background color, and then select this darkest color right here. Now we are going to create a shape for our landscape. We'll do that on layer 1, and we will be using the monoline brush, which you can find under calligraphy. And for our color, we will use the third color in the color palette, this dark blue. And we are going to create kind of a wobbly pear-like shape. And my brush is 40% in size. Now let's start at the bottom for our shape. Go up and make roughly a pear-like shape. And then you can drag in the color to fill your shape. Now you can see we have a little bit of a bump right here, but you can easily fix that by going over it with your brush. And if you want to play around with your shape a little bit more, you could go to the magic wand and use liquify. And while you have your brush set to a pretty big size, like around 70%, you can push and pull on your shape to adjust it a little bit until you have a shape that you like. I like it like this. Now let's get started on that landscape. We'll do that on a new layer, so we'll go to the layer palette and click the plus. I want our landscape to be inside of this shape. Now you could do that by setting this layer to layer clipping mask, but what we could also do is click this layer with the shape, then use select. That way we have a selection, a perfect selection of that shape. And when you have an active selection in Procreate, you can only paint inside of that selection. So that's very useful for our next layer. And the color we will use for this layer is this color right here, right next to that light blue. We are still using the monoline brush under calligraphy. And let's make the brush a little bit smaller. Let's say around 20%. And now we will make a sand dune. Of course, you can just follow my shape, or you can look up some references of deserts of these sand dunes to give you some inspiration. But it's a pretty simple shape. Now just drag in the color to fill your sand dune shape. And of course, you can tweak your shape a little bit by using your brush or by using the eraser, for example. You can just click and hold your eraser icon to switch to your current brush for the eraser. So now the eraser brush is also the monoline brush. And let me just tweak this hill just a little bit. I'm gonna cut a little part off, giving it a little bit more of an interesting shape. Now we can undo this selection by clicking that S-shaped ribbon. Next, we'll make a new layer. So go back to the layer palette and click the plus. I want to make the light side of this sand dune. So I want whatever I'm going to paint on this layer, I only want it to show up on that sand dune that we just created. So I will click the layer and use clipping mask. That way, whatever I paint on layer 3 will only show up on the shape of layer 2. And let's pick this color in the color palette. And now we will create something like a double S shape on our dune. And make sure that you close your shape, because even if you don't see that shape, it's there. So you'll have to close it before you fill it with color. And again, you can play around with your shape. You can use your brush to tweak it a little bit, and you can use the eraser to cut off some parts if that's needed. For instance, I want to cut off a little part here. And perhaps a little bit here. So you can just play around with the shapes until you have a sand dune that you like. Now let's get started on that starry sky, that Milky Way sky. We want that sky to be clipped to layer 1. We have that blue shape. And we only want our stars to show up on that shape. We don't want them on our dark background. So we'll make a new layer by clicking the plus, clicking the layer, and then use clipping mask. First, I would like to use the clouds brush. You can find it under elements. It's right here, the clouds brush, and we will use it to add some light to our sky. Let's pick this light blue in the color palette for that. The brush size is set to 40% and the opacity is at 100%. And let's add some lighter clouds to the bottom of that sky. And you can switch to a darker blue. Like this, very dark blue. We can add that to the top. And we can switch back to that base blue color and add a little bit of that to the middle. And now let's go to the adjustments. That's that magic wand and use Gaussian blur. Just swipe with your pen to the right to create a soft blur. Let's go for around 10%. And next, let's make a new layer. So we'll go back to the layer palette, click the plus for a new layer, and again, we will use layer clipping mask. So whatever we paint here will only show up on layer 1, on that shape. Now we will go to the luminance brushes. You have this nice glimmer brush there. But I'll have to take you through my settings that I have for the glimmer brush. I have set the spacing to max. Jitter is also set to max. And when you go to shape, you will see that scatter is also set to max. For our color, we will pick this very light blue color. And our brush size is 8%. And now with very gentle pressure, I will add these stars to the sky. I'll just go over the entire night sky, filling it with these very small stars. And the harder you press on your screen, if you have a pressure sensitive pen, then the stars will get bigger. So if I add extra pressure, as you can see, the stars become bigger. So I'm just going to fill that entire night sky. And add some bigger stars. I think this is enough stars. Next, let's create a Milky Way look. And the Milky Way, well, that's just a whole bunch of stars, and it looks a bit like a white starry cloud. So we will use the nebula brush for that. You can also find it under the luminance brushes. But let's just create a new layer for this. That way you have full control. In case you don't like the whole nebula look, you can always either decrease the opacity of your layer or just remove it entirely and start over. Just with the layer, of course, you won't have to start over with your entire painting. That's the great thing about layers. So we have created a new layer, setting it to clipping mask again. And now let's take this bright blue color from the color palette. For the brush size, I have it set to around 14%. And the opacity is set to around 70%. And now let's create a band going from that top of the hill to the top. And we can play around with our brush size. We can go a bit smaller. Let's go for 7%, for instance. And we're just creating that band. Now I'd also like to switch to this very light blue color. And let's make the brush a bit smaller. Let's go for 3%. Adding some of these light starry clouds. Now I'd also like to switch to a very dark color. We'll pick this very dark one, the second color in the color palette, and add with a small brush, we'll go to around 2%, add some darker specks. Just very subtle, some darker nebula clouds. That looks good. Next, let's start adding texture to our sand dune. Let's go to the layer palette again. And this time we'll be using Alpha Lock. So we'll click the dark side, that dark base dune layer, and we'll use Alpha Lock. What Alpha Lock does is it makes sure that on this layer, we can now only paint on the pixels, on the paint that is already on this layer. You can see in this icon, you can see that shape of the dune, and then you can see like that checkerboard. Those are transparent parts of that layer, and we can't paint on those parts, only on the dune. Now let's see what brush we can use here. Let's go to the artistic brushes and use Tauralea. Not sure how to pronounce the name of this brush, but yeah, let's just take a good look at the name so you can remember something like Tauralea. And let's pick this color right here. It's slightly lighter than that dark dune. I have the brush size set to 5% and the opacity is at 100%. And now let's follow the shape of the dune to create some texture. I'm gently going over that dune, adding extra texture. And let's add a little bit more here, as if light is hitting that part of the dune, and also here at the back. And it looks a little bit bluish. That's that blue from that night sky. It's reflected on that sand, on that dune. And let's also pick this a bit more purplish color. And let's add even more texture. So just follow that shape of the dune. And let's do the same for the light side of the dune. So we'll have to go to the layer with the light part that is clipped to the dark part. And again, we will use alpha lock here. So we will only be able to paint on that shape that is already there on the layer. We'll use the same brush and let's pick this lighter color. And let's add some light here. Again, I'm following the shape of the dune. And next, I want to show you a little trick. We will use a selection again. Let's go to the S-shaped ribbon. That's the selection tool. Go to freehand and select this part of the dune. Like this. So you know that now you can only paint inside of that selection. And that's very handy when you want to make a crisp line. We'll go to the brush again. And let's paint over this area, this edge. Lighten that up. And also add some more light here. And now when we turn off the selection by going to that S-shaped ribbon, you can see a nice sharp edge there. So using selections in your painting can be really handy. Let's add a little bit more light here near that edge to create some sandy texture. And now for our final touch, we need a nice bright moon in our sky. That'll just give it that little extra. We'll make a new layer for our moon. And we'll just put it on top of all the others. So just click plus to make a new layer. And for our brush, we'll go back to the monoline brush, which we can still find under calligraphy. And the color we will use is this very bright bluish color. Now we'll use the quick shape tool to create a perfect circle for our moon. So first, just draw a circle, hold your pen in place, and tap one finger on your screen to make a perfect circle. Now you can click Edit Shape if you want to move your circle around. Let's place it about here. And we can drag in the color to fill our moon. And now we will duplicate this layer with the moon. You can do that by swiping to the left on your layer and then click Duplicate. Now go to that bottom moon layer. By the way, if this is your first time following a Procreate tutorial, then it might be a great idea to check out my Skillshare class. It's all about getting started with digital painting in Procreate. I will teach you all the tools in Procreate, and eventually we will even paint a realistic looking apple in Procreate. So if you're just getting started, if you want to take things more serious in Procreate, then check out the link in the description to check out my Skillshare class. Now we will blur this bottom moon layer by going to the magic wand, the adjustments, and then going to Gaussian blur. Now you can just slide to the right again with your pen or your finger and add a little blur to our moon. You can go for around 17, 18%, something like that. And next, let's add a little texture to our moon. We'll do that on a new layer again. So first click that top moon layer, then the plus to create a new layer. And be sure to add layer clipping mask there. Because that way, whatever texture we are going to paint on this layer, it'll only show up on that moon. Let's grab a nice texture brush. You can find it under Industrial. Let's use the Rusted Decay. And for our color, we will use this bottom second color in the color palette. It's a bluish grayish color. Let's zoom in a little bit and drop on some texture onto this moon. let's set the brush to, well, I can hardly see it. Let's go for around 15%. And the opacity is at 100%. And let's drop in that texture now. Alright, we have this moon texture, and what you could do when you have that moon texture is go to the move tool and then go for warp. And now you can kind of wrap around this texture, wrap it around your moon. That way it'll look less flat. So we'll just use these. Well, first I pulled in the handles, moved them towards the moon, and wrap that texture around the moon. And you don't have to do it all precise, but it does give a less flat look. And you can move around the texture a little bit. So you can play around with the texture this way. I think it looks pretty, well, like I said, it looks pretty moony, right? Let's click that arrow again to get out of that menu and look at our scene. And there it is, our desert night scene. I hope you enjoyed following this tutorial. If you did, then you might want to check out my other You Can Draw This videos as well. Or you could just start out with these two videos over here. I will see you next time.